He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Tēnā koutou. I'm Tim Watkin, Executive Editor, Audio at RNZ. I'm sorry to say that there is no final episode to play here. No conclusion to this farce. No grand revelation from this book, and obviously no cat. Whatever Tim and Carlo hoped for this idiotic quest, we will never know, and frankly, we the public should be happy for our collective ignorance. The fact that they were able to covertly lock themselves away in our cryptozoological studio and to make 5 episodes as they have is a great shame to myself and to RNZ. And the irony that they embarked on their own conspiracy to avoid the Canterbury Cat conspiracy, to further indulge their Titanic conspiracy, is not lost on us. So, as perhaps my last act in this job, I would like to apologise to you all. I am deeply sorry. For full disclosure, I have decided to include the final day of testimony from the Aotearoa inquiry into the New Zealand Special Commission of Inquiry into the Misappropriation of Public Funds, held in June of this year. The Special Commission was comprised, as I'm sure you all know by now, of various high-ranking members of RNZ and Aotearoa New Zealand's Intelligence Service. We offer this testimony not by any means as an excuse, but as an admonishment for this season of Did Titanic Sink? I hope that you find it illuminating. Ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora, I'm Rose Matafeo, reading from Titanic and Other Ships by Charles Herbert Lightoller, published 1935. Captain E.J. was one of the ablest skippers on the Atlantic, and accusations of recklessness, carelessness, not taking due precautions, or driving his ship at too high a speed were absolutely and utterly unfounded. But the armchair complaint is a very common disease, and generally accepted as one of the necessary evils from which the seafarer is condemned to suffer. A dark night, a blinding squall, and a man who has been on the mental rack for perhaps the last 48 hours is called on to make an instantaneous decision embodying the safety of his crew and his ship. If he chooses the right course, as 9 times out of 10 he does, all well and good. But if on the 10th time his judgment is, momentarily, in error, then he may be certain he is coming under the thumb of the armchair judge, who, 1,000 to 1, has never been called on to make a life and death decision in a sudden emergency. Captain Smith, with every other senior officer, apart from myself, went down and was lost with the ship, and so escaped that never-to-be-forgotten ordeal carried out in Washington, repeated again in England, and finally concluded in the law courts. It was a colossal piece of impertinence that served no useful purpose and elicited only a garbled and disjointed account of the disaster, due in the main to a total lack of coordination in the questioning with an abysmal ignorance of the sea.
1, 2, 3.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Good afternoon.
There's now something of a political fight about how the money was awarded.
I've never seen a cat that big in my life.
The false evidence has been a key focus of the hearing.
After extensive legal advice, we have decided to air this season as a means of recouping the substantial losses incurred by both Radio New Zealand and indeed the nation.
We're back, baby. Did Titanic Sink Season 2?
Council Present, the Right Honourable Dame Helena Isaacs, KC, MP Dr Patrick Malone, Chair of Radio New Zealand Board of Governors, and the Honourable Kiri Tamaonga, ONZ, former Director of New Zealand's Security and Intelligence Services, attending upon request. Also present, Carlo Ritchie and Tim Badd. We now begin Day 11 of the New Zealand Special Commission of Inquiry into Misappropriation of Public Funds. Dame Isaacs.
We have heard testimony over the past 10 days as to the nature of the accusation levelled upon Mr Ritchie and Mr Batt, as well as arguments presented on the necessity of this public inquiry. Myself and Council Present will now hear from Mr Ritchie and Mr Batt in defence of their actions before we adjourn for final consideration upon this matter.
Thank you, Your Honour. Mr. Ritchie, how long have you been employed by Radio New Zealand?
I should say nearly 3 years.
And in what capacity are you employed?
As a contractor.
And under what conditions were you contracted for the second season of yours and Mr. Batt's podcast, Did Titanic Sink?
To write a second season.
I wish you would describe that a little bit more fully. What was the focus of this podcast?
Did Titanic sink?
More directly.
I could not say more directly.
Perhaps you could rephrase the question, Mr. Malone.
Radio New Zealand funded you under the...
Part of this question has been redacted as a matter of national security.
I put it to you, Mr. Ritchie, is it not fair to say then that you were hired to make a podcast about the Canterbury Cat?
As I see it, we did.
Did you hear what he says, Your Honour? Mr. Ritchie, the entire purpose of this inquiry is necessitated by the fact, as we have shown over the previous 10 days of testimony, that you and Mr. Batt were contracted to make a podcast about the Canterbury Cat.
That is what we set out to do, yes.
What you set out to do?
Yes, sir.
And what point did you leave the investigation into the Canterbury Cat?
I did not leave it. She left me.
Mr. Ritchie, I do not know if it is your intention to be difficult, but I do not think these questions are getting us anywhere.
Your Honour, I'd like to read a prepared statement, may it please the Commissioners. I understand now that Justin and the RNZ staff repeatedly warned us that we were going too far off course on our pursuit of the Canterbury Cat. The one vital report that came through, but which never reached myself or Carlo, came in shortly before we began recording in RNZ's cryptozoological studio, from Justin, stating, "At this point, you either have a f***ing cat in a cage or some very good explanations for what the hell you've been doing with government funds for the last 6 months." Philip, the studio operator who received the message, was not to know the extreme urgency of the warning, or that we were at the time actually entering the studio and were literally in the process of making our podcast. He was very busy working the radio booth, also with his accounts. Later, during the official inquiry, Philip explained when I said that I did not recollect Justin's message, quote, "I left it unplayed on my phone, just until I squared away what I was doing before sending it to you both." That delay proved fatal and was the main contributory cause to the loss of thousands of dollars of public funds. Now, if I may, I would like to hand off to my esteemed colleague, Carlo.
Dame Isaacs, councillors, my dear, simple friend Timothy. We set out at the beginning of this process to answer a simple question. Did Titanic sink?
I have to object to that. That is not the matter at hand. The question is whether you and your colleague, Mr. Batt, knowingly misled the public broadcaster for the misappropriation of public funds.
Let him speak.
This is outrageous.
You may continue, but as Councillor Malone has asserted, you are here to answer other more pressing questions, which I will assume that you mean to answer. I will stop you if you do not.
Thank you, Your Honour. To continue, we set out to answer the question, did Titanic sink? But before I can answer that question, and indeed all of the questions set out before us today, there is another question we must first answer for ourselves. What is the Canterbury Cat? To answer that, we must go back to the 10th of April 1910, shortly after noon. When Titanic set out from Southampton, she was the grandest ocean liner the world had ever seen. Indeed, the largest moving object hitherto built. Her passengers included some of the wealthiest people in the world, as well as some of the poorest. All of them, no matter their station, their property, their creed, all of them in awe of this magnificent vessel. 269.1 metres in length, 28.2 metres across. She was indeed, just as her name asserted for the world to know and see, Titanic. Dividing her into 16 sections, watertight bulkheads thrust upwards from her iron belly, fitted with electric doors that could be operated at just the touch of a button from the ship's bridge. These iron bulwarks, against which the sea would find no quarter, should she ever pierce this monstrous liner, were part of a swathe of modern safety apparatus, in their totality giving the impression that this was a liner against which the forces of nature could not prevail, whose very existence was proof that humanity had finally conquered the sea. That vast, unrelenting mistress to which all our lives are tethered, that unbound temptress who had drowned empires and conquered gods, that great force who had taught us, forced us to humility. had now been humbled. Humbled by the ingenuity of humankind, by hard-forged steel and the bravest hearts of those who dared to sail upon the sea in ships. Never again would we be cowed into fear by the wrath of the waves. Never again would we wonder what lay behind the hills of the sea. Never again would we cast our eyes to the big wet and think, too tricky. No, in Titanic, we had won.
I fail to see how any of this is relevant to the question.
As the former head of New Zealand's Security and Intelligence Service, SIS, I would like to hear what he has to say. On behalf of the security community of New Zealand, please continue, Mr. Ritchie.
I'm sorry, Councillor. I fail to understand why the former head of the SIS is even at this meeting. It makes no sense to me.
Well, for want of a better metaphor, there is a lot going on under the surface that you can't see. As you were, Mr. Ritchie.
Thank you, Your Honour. Using the word grand to describe Titanic would be akin to representing the pyramids at Giza as neat. Indeed, the ship's own grand staircase shames any staircase that had before or since used that title. Titanic was a staggering monument to the technical skill and artistic mastery of the golden age of steam. The last ferry I rode on had a Billy Bass mounted on the wall singing John Bon Jovi lyrics. Titanic's centre point? A beautiful hardwood clock framed by two robed angels. A visual allegory representing honour and glory crowning time.
Allegory. It's allegory.
For it was these, more than any other, that formed the philosophical core of Titanic. Honour and glory.
Mr. Ritchie, we are now moving into the philosophical, and I will remind you to stay to the point at hand.
Of course, Your Honour. Honour. It's a powerful word, isn't it? Honour. So too glory. Seldom words we hear in these so-called modern times. They're ideals that we too often forget in this age of algorithms and singing robotic fish. How fitting, then, that these very words so readily apply to Charles Lightoller, Aotearoa's distant son, whose kin's blood runs in your very soil. A man of honour, a man of glory. Hero of RMS Titanic and the evacuations at Dunkirk, he was a champion of not one, but two historic events later immortalised as films with soundtracks that made my dear friend Tim want to climb a mountain and cry at its summit. Lightoller kept true to the ideals of honour. Found, while seeking it, glory. You have heard over these past days the actions of this man in that fateful final hours of the unsinkable ship, his own recollections and reflections. So too have you heard my own and others' critiques of these actions. Were his actions on his final watch sufficient for the conditions? No. Did his interpretation of women and children lead to unnecessary death? Yes. Did he lie to the official inquiries? Probably yes. Just like Celine Dion's heart, these questions could go on and on. But there is one question we have not asked. Is Lightoller a hero or a villain? And to answer this question, Your Honour, I must return to the subject at hand, the Canterbury Cat. And so we should begin by asking, what is the Canterbury Cat?
Oh, come on. Mr. Ritchie needs to answer these serious charges against himself and Mr. Batt for stealing public funds for a passion project about a debunked conspiracy theory.
This is a valid objection, Mr. Ritchie. I'm certainly relieved that we are finally talking about the Canterbury Cat, but so far you haven't provided any defence for your actions. Is there a point to this?
Your Honour, if I can continue, I hope you'll see that the necessity for these tangents.
This is a public inquiry. We have granted your request to argue in your defence, and you instead have gone on and on about antiquated subjects like honour and glory, which have no place in the...
3 minutes of discussion has been redacted from this transcript as a matter of national security.
Fine.
You may continue.
Thank you, Your Honour. All of us now know the stories, the conspiracies, the myth of this cat. Somewhere in the back country of Te Waiponamo. An escaped tiger? A panther? A giant feral cat? What if none of these answers mattered? What if the real Canterbury Cat was inside us the whole time? Maybe the Canterbury cat isn't a fantastical beast lost in the wilds. Maybe the Canterbury cat is an idea. Something within all of us made manifest. That jet black part of us that's impossible to understand, to make sense of the vagaries of history, the space between our recorded history and the mysteries of the physical world we inhabit. A disconnect maintained by our own limitations as humans. Did a tiger escape from a local early 20th century circus, only to be quietly recaptured and the incident never reported? Will we ever know how many people died aboard Titanic, or for that matter, how many were saved? Did Charles Lightoller know about the presence of icebergs dead ahead of the Titanic's course that fateful night in 1912? These are impossible questions. My point, your worships, Charles Lightoller is a Canterbury cat. Is he not also the product of a vague outline, glimpsed through fragmented accounts, who through the chrysalis of time is crowned in honour and glory? He is a hero and he is a villain. Or perhaps he is neither. Or perhaps he is both. We know by his own words that he misled the Titanic inquiries, but we also know that he did so to protect the legacy of his friends and colleagues, and the industry that since the age of 13 had been his home, his family, his life. We know his actions led to many men not leaving Titanic in lifeboats, who could otherwise have been saved, but we also know that his actions aboard Collapsible B undoubtedly led to the survival of those who otherwise would have been lost. Charles Lightoller was a man upon whom was thrust a duty that most of us will never know, in times we can barely comprehend, at a time for which records that survive to this day are sketchy at best. Perhaps it is as the man himself writes, that armchair critics such as myself and Tim are the necessary evil that the seafarer is condemned to suffer, a judgment made in comfort by those who have never been called on to make a life and death decision in a sudden emergency. Did Tim and I mislead Radio New Zealand when we pitched a podcast about a local cryptozoological folktale just to use the substantial budget to fund a deeper dive into the Titanic? Perhaps. Perhaps it was all a passion project, disguised by lofty goals and these final philosophical musings. Or maybe in trying to find a man, we found a cat. In trying to understand how the vagaries of time fragment to 1,000 questions, of which some can never be answered, did we not find a common ground between a mysterious mammal stalking the hills of the South Island and a man whose life was forever stalked by the hills of the sea? And so, we ask the most important question of all. Did Titanic sink? And the answer is probably still yes. But much like Titanic's final hours or the footsteps of a mysterious cat, we can never be certain. I wish that in unpacking the legacy of one man, I could get closer to the answer I know my poor dear friend Tim so desperately wants to hear me say. But sadly, again, I must conclude that history probably got it right with this one. And yet, there is still that doubt that niggles at the back of my brain. Still that possibility I cannot wholly discount. What if, in this conspiracy, there was some truth yet to be found better, and in understanding Lightoller, we might extend the question, did Titanic sink, or was she sunk? If we are guilty of anything, Your Honours, it is of ambition, and possibly a tiny dollop of fraud. And so, I would ask you, Your Worships, that our actions be judged by these two great ideals, rather than the simple pecuniary interests that have become so generally accepted as a necessary evil of which the podcast is condemned to suffer.
I agree.
Kia ora. My name's Justin Gregory. I've been asked to step in and speak on behalf of RNZ, the board, the minister, and indeed, God above. It's my duty to inform you that the final verdict in this case has been redacted in the interests of national security. Thank you for listening, and I apologise for all that you've had to go through over the course of Did Titanic Sink 2, The Tale of the Canterbury Cat.
Tim Batt here, speaking of my own free will and under no duress. Turn to page 2. Thanks for listening to Season 2 of Did Titanic Sink? We've had some laughs, we've learnt some facts, and in no way did we uncover the New Zealand government's knowledge and protection of a large cat or cats in Te Waipounamu. Any suggestion of a broader conspiracy here is laughable, and I would know I'm just a dumb comedian who you'd be a fool to believe. Bit harsh. Did Titanic Sink Season 2 was written by Carlo Ritchie, Abby Howells and Tim Batt, and directed by Abby Howells, with the voices of Kura Forrester, Sam Snedden, Abby Howells, Donna Brookbanks, Justin Gregory, Tim Watkin and Rose Matafeo. Thanks to executive producers for RNZ, Justin Gregory and Tim Watkin. Special thanks to audio engineer Tim Duck at Verst Productions. Original theme music by Eilish Wilson. Our thanks again to the Titanic Inquiry Project, and a very big thank you to Bruce and the family of Charles Lightoller. If you like the show, why not leave us a review? Thanks for listening, and never stop believing the stars are real.
I maintain anyone who really does write a diary just is slightly mad. But you know what? God bless them, because then you get this stuff, so that's great.